I first spotted her, Nyra, a wild peregrine falcon, high above the red cliffs at dawn, her wings slicing the air like a silent blade. She wasn't hunting, she was circling something, watching. Beneath her, curled in a hollow of wind-carved stone, was a kitten, alone. I remember the way the sun hit the rocks that morning, gold and solemn like nature itself was holding its breath. I'd come out looking for hawks to photograph, but I found Thimble instead. And more than that, I found Nyra standing guard, a falcon acting like a mother. I had no idea how much that moment would change everything. The canyon was silent except for the faint rustle of sagebrush and the occasional screech of Nyra's wings overhead. I moved slowly, careful not to startle her or the tiny creature below. The kitten lay wedged between two stones, too weak to cry out, her fur matted with dust and her ribs showing with every shallow breath. I could tell she hadn't been there long, but long enough for the desert to start working against her. What stunned me wasn't just that she'd survived this long, it was the falcon. Nyra swooped low as I approached, cutting across the sky in a defensive arc. She didn't fly off like most raptors would when a human got close. No, she hovered, watched me with eyes that didn't blink. It was like she was warning me, not out of aggression, but instinct, something deeper. I crouched down, whispering gently, and lifted the kitten, barely a handful, into my jacket. Nyra didn't attack. She landed on a nearby branch and just stared, not as a predator, as a witness. I radioed Elena back at the sanctuary, told her I had a neonatal kitten and, well, a falcon involved somehow. She thought I was joking. I wasn't. Jacob, the rancher whose land bordered this canyon, had always told me nature didn't need rescuing, that I should leave things be. But this didn't feel like a human stepping in. It felt like I was just continuing something Nyra had already started, and that terrified me more than anything. Back at the sanctuary, Elena met me outside with a heating pad and a skeptical look. "A falcon," she said, raising an eyebrow. I gently pulled Thimble from my jacket, her tiny paws limp but her eyes flickering open. Elena's tone changed instantly. "Get her inside." We set her up in a quiet corner under a heat lamp, barely daring to hope she'd make it through the night. She was dehydrated, starving, and likely no more than 4 weeks old. But even then, there was something stubborn in her. Every time someone reached into her crate, she'd bat at their fingers with surprising fire, like the wild had left its print on her. But the strangest part? Nyra didn't vanish. Every morning for the next 3 days, I'd see her perched on the old weather antenna above the canyon's edge. Same spot, same time, watching. Once I swear she followed my truck down the ridge for half a mile before veering off. Elena didn't say much about it, but I caught her watching the falcon too, arms folded tight, her scientist mind clearly struggling with what she was seeing. Then came the debate. What now? Jacob was the first to voice it. "Leave it to nature," he said when I told him. "She won't survive in a cage, neither of them will." But Elena had other ideas. "We don't interfere, we respond," she said, tracing Thimble's tiny spine with a fingertip. "The falcon brought her to us. That means something." And that's when the tension started. On the 5th morning, the air felt different before I even stepped outside, thicker somehow, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. The sun had only just begun to stretch its light across the mesa tops when I slipped out with my coffee, expecting to see Nyra perched in her usual spot, sharp-eyed and still, like a sentinel carved from stone. But the sky above the ridge was empty. The antenna where she'd always sat stood bare against the lavender dawn. I scanned the ledges, the rock spines, the air, but no sign of her. That was when I saw it, a single feather, wedged unnaturally into the splintered grain of the fence post near the outer gate. It was long, with that telltale curve of a peregrine's primary, but mottled with dirt, and at its base a dark smear of dried blood. I didn't move for a long time. My fingers tightened around the coffee cup until the ceramic clicked against my knuckles, the heat forgotten. A shiver crawled beneath my skin, not from the cold, but from something heavier, an unspoken truth pressing against the edge of my thoughts. Nyra was gone, or hurt. The presence that had lingered like breath on the back of my neck for days had vanished, and with it, the silent pact we'd somehow formed. Back inside, Thimble was curled tighter than usual in the far corner of her crate, her body rigid, eyes unblinking. And for the first time, she let out a cry, not a weak mule, but a sharp, panicked wail that cracked straight through me. When Jacob showed up that evening, his face pale and uncertain, he held a towel in both hands like it contained something sacred. Wordlessly, he unwrapped it on the table. A small rabbit, its fur clean, no signs of struggle, no blood. "Found it on my porch," he said quietly, almost embarrassed. "Just left there." And though he didn't say it, we both knew what it meant. Elena arrived the next morning, her boots crunching over frost-laced gravel as the last threads of mist peeled off the canyon's edge. She didn't say much at first, just took the rabbit in her hands, examining the soft curve of its body, the eerie lack of any damage. "This wasn't dropped," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "This was placed." I nodded slowly, still watching the antenna, still hoping Nyra would reappear in the rising light. But there was only silence, and the kind of emptiness that sinks deep into your ribs when you realize something is truly gone. Back inside, Thimble hadn't moved from her crate's corner. Her food sat untouched. She flinched even at Elena's gentle voice, as if whatever thread had been holding her together was now unraveling. Jacob came by again that afternoon, less skeptical now, more unsettled. He leaned on the fence post beside me, arms crossed, his usual bravado gone. "You think the bird's dead?" He asked without looking at me. I didn't answer. I didn't know. But Elena did. "Not dead," she said quietly. She passed the torch. Jacob scoffed, but not with malice, more like a man unsure of what world he'd wandered into. "You two talk like this is a story, like it means something." "It does," I said, and for the first time I felt it down in my bones, not as hope, but as responsibility. Whatever Nyra had started, we weren't meant to finish it. We were meant to carry it. The sanctuary wasn't immune to whispers, and it didn't take long before word of the falcon-raised kitten story began to stretch beyond the canyon. Elena had fielded a reporter's call by the end of the week, someone from a local wildlife journal sniffing around for a headline. She waved it off, but I could see the unease in her eyes. What we were holding wasn't a story, not really. It was a threadbare miracle, and too much attention could unravel it. Then came the first threat. One of the sanctuary's outer pens had been cut open, sloppily but intentional. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just violated, as if someone wanted us to know they'd been there. We found fresh boot prints, deep and staggered, leading away from the property and into the lower brush near Jacob's land. He was furious when I showed him. "Someone's messing with you," he said, jaw tight, "and I don't think it's about a cat." But it was about Thimble and Nyra, and the story no one else could quite believe. To make matters worse, Thimble began refusing food. She'd sit, glassy-eyed in her blanket nest, barely lifting her head. Elena changed her formula. We tried hand-feeding, even letting her rest against my chest the way Nyra used to hover above her. Nothing worked. The life in her seemed to dim by the hour, like a candle that had burned too brightly for too long. And still, Nyra didn't return. The weight of letting go was becoming harder to ignore, and none of us were ready. That night, long after Elena had gone and Jacob's truck had disappeared into the dust, I sat alone beside Thimble's crate, the only sound the low hum of the heater and her faint, uneven breathing. I had one hand inside, resting just close enough that she could feel the warmth if she wanted it. She didn't move, but she didn't pull away either. That somehow felt heavier than silence. I found myself whispering to her, nonsense really, stories I imagined Nyra might have told if she could speak. About wind and feathers, about cliffs and flight and quiet strength. I wanted her to know she hadn't been abandoned, but deep down I wondered if maybe she had been released. If Nyra, in her wild knowing, had brought this kitten as far as she could and trusted the rest to us. And here I was, struggling with a question I never thought I'd have to ask. Was I keeping her alive because she still had a chance, or because I couldn't bear to be the one to say goodbye? Rescue, I was learning, wasn't always about saving. Sometimes it was about surrender, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to do that. 2 days later, just after dawn, Jacob called. I could tell by the gravel in his voice that something had happened. "You need to come down here," he said. "Bring Elena." We drove out along the old service road, the truck rattling over washboard gravel as the morning sun burned off the last of the haze. Jacob met us at the edge of a ravine behind his property, where the land dipped into a narrow arroyo lined with juniper and brush. There, nestled at the base of a wind-felled cottonwood, was what remained of a nest, twigs and feathers scattered in a wide, torn ring. And there, half buried in the sand, was Nyra's tracking band. Elena crouched down, turning the metal ring over in her fingers. "No tag, wild-born," she murmured, but someone marked her. She held up a broken leather jess, worn and old, falconry gear. Someone had once owned her. The realization hit like a stone to the chest. Nyra had been rescued once too, trained, maybe loved, maybe released or escaped. And now, whoever she had once belonged to might be looking for her. Or worse, might have already found her. Back at the sanctuary, Thimble stirred for the first time in days. She climbed, wobbly but determined, into my hand. I held her there, and for a flickering second it felt like something was returning. Not all of it, not certainty, but maybe just enough. But the danger hadn't passed. If anything, it had gotten closer. In the days that followed, the mood at the sanctuary shifted. Not because anything had been resolved, but because everything now felt connected. The feather, the rabbit, the nest, the band. It was as if Nyra's entire story had bled into ours, and none of us could move without feeling the weight of it. Elena became quieter, more focused. She stayed later, sleeping on the couch in her office some nights, often watching Thimble with a mix of scientific curiosity and something softer, something closer to awe. Thimble, for her part, was changing too. She had started to follow sound again, lifting her head when I spoke, pressing her nose into my palm when I reached for her. Her appetite came back in small, steady bursts. She was still fragile, her body thin and legs shaky, but there was life in her again, and more than that, intention. One morning, I found her curled in the crook of my hoodie sleeve, fast asleep, her body rising and falling in rhythm with my breath. I didn't move for nearly an hour, but things outside weren't quiet. A car we didn't recognize slowed by the sanctuary gate twice in the same week. A drone buzzed overhead and vanished before we could track it. And when Jacob checked his motion sensor cameras near the lower arroyo, they showed a man walking the trail alone, face obscured, pausing near the broken nest and staring into the canyon for nearly 15 minutes before walking off the way he came. Whoever Nyra had once belonged to, they were watching. And we didn't know if they wanted her back or wanted what she'd left behind. I looked at Thimble, now curled in a basket of blankets, and realized I wasn't just caring for her anymore. I was protecting her. The conversation we'd all been avoiding finally came to the table under the low hum of the sanctuary's generator and the smell of burnt coffee. It was late, and the wind had picked up outside, pushing at the windows like it wanted in. Elena sat across from me, arms crossed, a storm behind her eyes. Jacob leaned against the doorframe, silent but uneasy. And I sat with Thimble tucked in the crook of my arm, asleep, unaware that the moment we'd all feared had arrived. "We need to consider rehoming her," Elena said softly but firmly. "If someone's watching the sanctuary, if Nyra's connection to her is drawing attention, it might not be safe to keep her here." The words sat heavy between us like stones dropped into still water. I didn't answer at first. I couldn't. My gut twisted at the thought. Give her up? After everything? After Nyra brought her here? After the nights we nearly lost her? After the soft weight of her heartbeat against mine? "Elena," I said finally, trying to steady my voice, "you didn't see the way Nyra guarded her. That wasn't random. She chose this. She chose us." Jacob sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That may be," he muttered, "but if someone comes looking and they don't care what we believe, what then? You willing to put her in the middle of that?" And that's when I realized the truth. I wasn't deciding what was safest. I was deciding whether I could let go, whether I trusted the world to hold her the way we had. It wasn't a question of rescue anymore. It was a question of release. The sanctuary felt like it was holding its breath. Every creak of the windmill, every flutter of wings in the rafters, felt sharper now, like the edges of our world had narrowed to the point of snapping. We tried to keep things going, feedings, field calls, vet check-ins, but the truth was, everything revolved around Thimble, and whether or not she was going to stay. Elena worked late that night. I found her packing a travel crate with blankets and a heating disc. She didn't say anything when I walked in, just kept moving, methodical, like someone preparing for a storm they couldn't stop. "Where would she go?" I asked finally. My voice cracked despite me trying to hold it steady. Elena didn't look up. There's a foster program in Santa Fe. Quiet, secure, no public access. They'd keep her safe. But that wasn't the question I'd meant to ask. I wasn't asking where she would go. I was asking who would be there to watch her sleep, to tell her Nyra stories in the middle of the night. Who would know that she hated the dark corners and loved the sound of wind chimes? "I'm not a good goodbye," I said quietly. "I don't know how to be." Jacob was outside by the truck, waiting, keys in hand. He didn't offer advice this time. Just stood there watching the horizon like it might give him an answer. And inside me, something broke. Or maybe it opened. This wasn't about who deserved her. It was about who could protect her future. And sometimes, loving something means stepping out of its way. The sun was barely over the canyon wall when I placed Thimble in the crate. She didn't fight. That was the part that shattered me. She blinked up at me, slow and soft, her body calm but trusting. As if she knew I was doing something I didn't want to. As if she was letting me. Elena stood nearby, arms folded, not saying a word. She knew better than to offer comfort right then. And Jacob, hands in his jacket pockets, stayed a few steps behind us near the truck. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and sun-warmed earth. Somewhere high above, a kestrel cried out across the ravine, shrill, fleeting, gone. I carried the crate to the passenger seat and paused with the door open, my hand resting on the roof. The silence was louder than anything. "This isn't the end," Elena said gently. "It's just not the chapter you thought it would be." But I didn't respond. I was watching the sky. In the distance, slicing across the morning light with that unmistakable grace, a dark shape soared, wings outstretched, gliding along the ridge without a single flap. My breath caught. Nyra, or something that reminded me of her. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe it was the canyon's way of saying goodbye. Thimble stirred inside the crate and let out a tiny sound, not distressed, just present. I closed the door softly and stepped back. Jacob started the engine. And in that moment, I felt everything at once. Grief, gratitude, pride, and the unbearable weight of knowing I wouldn't be the one to see her grow up. I just hoped that wherever she was going, they'd understand what it meant to be loved by something wild. The drive to Santa Fe was quiet. Jacob didn't ask questions. Elena sat in the back beside the crate, whispering softly to Thimble every few minutes, her fingers tucked through the grate like she was trying to give comfort without words. I drove, hands tense on the wheel, my mind drifting through every moment that had brought us here. Nyra's shadow against the cliff wall, the rabbit on the porch, the battered feather on the fence post, each image flashed like pieces of a dream I wasn't ready to wake from. The foster center was tucked into a quiet neighborhood just beyond the city. Low adobe walls, shaded courtyards, and the low sound of wind moving through cottonwoods. A woman met us at the gate, her face kind, her eyes knowing. She didn't ask for backstory, just opened the door and smiled like she understood everything that had been lost and everything we were trying to preserve. I lifted Thimble out myself. She blinked slowly in the warm light, resting her head against my palm like she always did. My chest ached with every step toward that door. "This isn't forever," the woman said gently. "If she needs to come back, if anything changes, you call me. We don't forget where they come from." I nodded, but I couldn't answer. As I placed Thimble in her new space, something caught in my throat. I didn't kiss her. I didn't speak. I just laid a single feather beside her blanket, Nyra's. Then I walked away. Outside, the air felt both heavier and freer, as if a chapter had closed that none of us had wanted to end. And even though I'd left her behind, I knew she'd never stop being mine. It's been weeks now, but the sanctuary hasn't quite gone back to what it was. The wind still hums through the canyon walls, the hawks still ride the thermals above the cliffs, and the sun still breaks each morning across the stone in a wash of gold and fire. But something in me is different. It's quieter. Worn, maybe, but not in a way that feels like loss. More like something was carved out and filled with something else, something stronger. Thimble is doing well. I get updates, brief messages, photos where she's curled in sunbeams, stretching out her legs, playing with threads. She's growing into her own name, into her own skin. I stare at those pictures longer than I admit, looking for traces of the kitten I first found in the dirt, framed by wings. Sometimes, I still return to that ridge at sunrise. I bring my camera, but I don't always shoot. I just sit, watching the sky where Nyra used to fly. I haven't seen her since that final morning, but I feel her in the wind, in Thimble's eyes, in the part of me that learned how to love something without holding on. Rescue isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always end in keeping. Sometimes, the truest act of love is letting go at the exact moment your heart tells you to hold tighter. And if you're lucky, that moment leaves you changed. Not broken, just opened. If this story moves something in you, if you've ever had to let go of something you loved or found yourself changed by an animal who crossed your path, take a moment, reflect. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to follow more journeys like Thimble's, stories of unexpected bonds, quiet courage, and the kind of love that asks for nothing in return, consider subscribing. There's more to come. More stories that remind us that sometimes rescue isn't about saving a life, but honoring the way it chose to live. Thank you for watching.